Good evening. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, we are on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota land ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The history department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And indeed, the book we're going to be talking about tonight focuses in part on a different case of settler colonialism. I also want to say just briefly, it's not usually part of my spiel, but that in the current moment, I want to reaffirm our commitment to academic freedom, and that's what allows us to have these kind of wonderful events and the kind of research that we can share. So I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the current chair of the history department. I'm really thankful for those of you who have joined us this evening. And I'm also thankful to Amanda Nelson, who is doing the logistics for our Zoom and will keep things running behind the scenes. So this is a series that was started by the previous chair, Ann Waltner, during the pandemic as a chance to bring people together and feature books by faculty and alumni of our program. And so we'll have some time to hear from our featured author, and then she'll be in conversation with another alum for about a half an hour, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. And at any point when you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A, I will read those out. So it's a great pleasure this evening to welcome back Elizabeth Dillenberg, who completed her PhD in our department in 2019 and also served for a time as the editorial assistant to the journal Gender and History when it was edited here, and I was one of those co-editors. She's currently assistant professor of history at The Ohio State University. And she'll be in conversation with Rachel Newert, who completed her PhD in our department in 2009, and Nywert, I want to get her name right, and is associate professor of history just over the river in St. Paul at St. Kate's University. Her research also focuses on modern British history with a particular emphasis on children and education in the empire. But she's also engaged in a new research project with students focused closer to home entitled Welcoming the Dear Neighbor, A History of Housing Inequality in Ramsey County. So the book that we're featuring tonight is Empire's Daughters, Girlhood, Whiteness, and the Colonial Project. And so with that, I will turn things over to Elizabeth to tell us a bit about her book.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction and for also organizing the book club. My thanks too to Amanda Nelson and the University of Minnesota History Department for their support in putting together this event. And I also wanted to extend my appreciation to Rachel Nywert for joining me in this conversation. And lastly, my thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here this evening. The genesis of Empire's Daughters extends back to my time as a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. The guidance and insights of my advisors, MJ Maines and Anna Clark, as well as conversations with many members of the history department, both during and after my time as a student, were formative to the writing of this book. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to share with you the product of these conversations and collaborations. Now, Empire's Daughters is available as a hardback, but I also wanted to mention that it is also available as an ebook for free. And this is thanks to the Ohio State University Open Access Monograph Initiative. And so I have on the slide a code, and if you scan that code, you should be able to access the link that will then take you to the ebook. When I set out to write Empire's Daughters, my goal was to understand how girls and ideas of girlhood were central to the British Empire in social, racial, and gendered constructions of power. I also wanted to analyze how the empire shaped girls' lives. What were the experiences of empire like for these girls? How did they understand and engage with the empire? What roles did they have in the colonial project? And in my book, I use an organization known as the Girls Friendly Society, or GFS, as really a lens to examine these questions. The GFS was one of numerous youth organizations to emerge at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it actually still exists today. And as you can see from the top banner, this year it's celebrating its 150th anniversary, but it's not that well known. And this is because it was eclipsed by the more popular Girl Guides. And this is the British equivalent of the Girl Scouts. Now, on the surface, the GFS appears as something of a parochial organization, and you can get that sense from the images that you see on the slide. But what I found once I delved into the archives of the organization is that the GFS was actually deeply embedded and invested in the empire. Within the first decade of its foundation in 1875, the GFS had established branches throughout the empire. And by the commencement of the 20th century, the GFS had over 1,400 branches that included over 240,000 girls and women. And the image that you see at the center of the slide is actually from a cover of one of the many periodicals produced by the GFS. But this really gives you a sense of the global reach of the organization. So it's showing where the different branches are located of the GFS around the world. Now, as part of this imperial work, the GFS also developed empire education and migration programs, which I'll talk about more in a moment. So although the GFS forms the framework of my book, Empire's Daughters is not an institutional history. And instead, what I argue is that the GFS is really this microcosm of empire. And through the study of the GFS, we can better understand the complexities of girls' participation in the empire. And we can also see how the construction of girlhood, conceptualizations of whiteness, and British colonial power were inextricably linked. And we can see this, for instance, by looking at the GFS's education programs, which encourage girls to learn more about the British colonies in order to transform them into empire builders. So, for instance, one of the facets of this program was scrapbook competitions and scrapbook exchanges. And this was really seen as an opportunity for girls to learn about colonial history and geography, and if they lived in the British colonies, to share their experiences of colonial life. So the images that you see on the slide are actually of a scrapbook created as part of the scrapbook exchange program. And this was created by various branches in West Australia. But the purpose of these exchanges is really to give girls in England insight into what it was like to be in Australia. So this scrapbook then circulated to branches in England following its completion. And I have another one here, and this one was created by a branch in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Now, the GFS also had several newsletters or periodicals, almost all of which contained some kind of imperial topic or imperial theme. And actually, in 1913, the GFS began a periodical that was specifically devoted to the empire, called The Empire and Beyond. And you can see that at the center of the slide. The GFS also organized imperial celebrations. So on the slide, you can see an image of the GFS marking the holiday of Empire Day. And this was really celebrated in Britain and throughout the empire as a way to instill imperial patriotism and pride. They also orchestrated pageants and plays. And you can see one such pageant and play on the slide. Now, within these pageants and plays, as you can see, imperial topics formed a recurring theme. And especially what was highlighted was the GFS's missionary work. So these pageant and plays were really these opportunities for the GFS to advertise its imperial work. But what it was also doing was basically having girls rehearse the roles that the GFS organizers hoped they would fulfill in the future as adults. So here we can see girls sort of playing being missionaries, but it was hoped that when they would become adults that they would actually go out into the empire and be missionaries. And I have here another slide with a couple of images of these pageants and plays. The pervasiveness of the empire in these programs indicates its centrality to girls' lives. Far from being these innocuous and apolitical forms of entertainment, we see how pageants, plays, celebrations, and scrapbooks were powerful vehicles of imperial ideology. And one theme that I want to emphasize is that girls were not passive observers. Instead, they were active participants. And we can see this. They were actively participating in the production of pageants and plays and the creation of scrapbooks. So, through their active participation in these programs, they were really instrumental in creating and constructing ideas and images of empire, race, and girlhood. Now, the GFS hoped that its empire education programs would encourage its members to migrate from England to the colonies. And to advance this goal and assist in moving girls around the empire, the GFS would actually establish its own immigration department. And you can see on the slide different documents related to this department. The GFS had a clear view of how colonial societies should be structured and the role of girls and young women in these societies. In their capacities as future homemakers, wives, and mothers, girls were supposed to help ensure the futurity of the British Empire and make colonial societies more white. However, girls did not unquestioningly follow the plans of the organizers. And in the book, for instance, I feature the stories of two servants, Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook, who immigrate from England to Southern Africa to work as domestic servants. But they are actually so unhappy in their position as domestic servants in Southern Africa, so upset at the false promises of immigration propaganda that brought them out there, that they will break their contract and run away. And you can actually see some documents that I was able to find in the archive about Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook. In the book, I also talk about the story of Violet Paul. Now, Violet Paul was also a member of the GFS who traveled from London to India to marry W.E. Davis. W.E. Davis was an Anglo-Indian man, so that means that he was of both British and Indian descent. Now, by eloping to marry an Anglo-Indian man and not a white Englishman, Paul was actually subverting the goals of the GFS, which was to create good white homes. So GFS organizers would frequently frame immigration in terms of imperial duty, but as we can see from the examples of Eliza Hobbs, Eliza Cook, and Violet Paul, girls had, in a sense, their own agenda. They had little interest in these broader imperial objectives and instead viewed immigration as a means to achieving their personal goals and in terms of their own interests. The GFS's immigration programs were not unidirectional. They also developed schemes for girls to travel from the colonies like India to Britain. And the idea was that these girls would be fulfilling critical labor shortages in England, so that girls would work, for instance, as children's nurses, servants, or as medical and health workers. And I have on the slide some documents related to one such program in India that was about training girls in India to then migrate and undertake these roles in Britain. However, these programs were not ultimately very successful, and there's a couple of reasons for why they were not very successful. One is that girls faced racist attitudes when they went to England, and they had a hard time finding a place to live and also employment. But we also see that girls and their families would push back against these programs. The GFS framed these programs as really trying to improve the lives of girls, as uplifting them. But girls and their families realized that these programs were actually really a mode of exploitation. The failure of these migration programs is symptomatic of the GFS's uneasy and complicated, to put it mildly, relationship with race. There were often not enough white girls in the colonies to sustain the organization, making the inclusion of girls of color essential to the GFS's survival in Britain's colonies. And although the GFS admitted girls of color, it did so with considerable reservations and did not intend for girls of color to be full members of the GFS in the same way that white girls were. For instance, in South Africa, it refused to financially support branches for colored, that is, mixed race girls, and insisted that there be separate branches for white girls and colored girls, and actually worked to exclude colored and Black girls from the organization altogether. Now, girls recognize their secondary status within the organization, and the lack of equality between GFS branches for white girls and colored girls led colored girls to leave the GFS. In 1906, for instance, a branch of colored girls in Cape Town withdrew from the GFS because they are not on an equal footing with the white members. They gain nothing by belonging to the GFS. The society gains strength from them. Now, other reports in the GFS records indicate that this was not a unique incident, that actually similar incidents occurred in other cities in Southern Africa, including East London and Port Elizabeth, but also with other branches in Cape Town. The decision of colored girls to leave the GFS demonstrate that the inequities of the organization did not go uncontested. The decision of girls to leave or not even join the organization due to its racist policies, and also because they felt their voices were not heard, reveals another way that girls push back against the imperatives of GFS leaders and also the broader imperial goals of the organization. I mentioned at the beginning that the GFS continues to exist today, but its popularity really began to decline in the interwar years. And there are many reasons for its decline, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But one of the crucial factors in its waning influence was its exclusionary practices and the fact that it continued to prioritize whiteness. And this meant that it failed to reach a significant population of girls. So what I argue in Empire's Daughters is that far from being peripheral and insignificant figures in the British Empire, girls had a critical role in constructing and also disrupting colonial societies and identities. And by centering girls in imperial history, we can gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of how the empire functioned, and also how the legacies of colonialism continue to shape girls' lives and reverberate in our world today.
All right. Thank you. Elizabeth, it's so fun to get to be here tonight with you. I feel like for years we've been running into each other at conferences where I've gotten to hear bits and pieces of your book. And so it was so fun to get to hold it in my hands and get to read it. So thanks for inviting me to talk with you tonight. So I told Elizabeth before we started talking tonight that this hour is really a delight for me because in my life as a historian at St. Kate's, I actually hardly ever get to be a British historian. So it's kind of fun for an hour to get to be a British historian again. And so when Elizabeth and I talked a little bit about what we would talk about tonight, we have a couple of questions that we'll talk about together. We'll talk about some of the content of the book, but we also thought it would be interesting to think about some of the process too. Imagining that perhaps there are some graduate students here and maybe those process questions are interesting as well. But an easy way to get us started is just, I think it's so interesting that you found this, incredible organization, the Girls Friendly Society, right? Which opens up all this space to think about the British Empire, to think about ideas of girlhood, to think about ideas of whiteness. I similarly in my work found this organization that I worked on, but how did you find this organization? What brought it to your attention?
Thanks for asking that question. And yeah, I mean, I was so interested in the organization that you write about and kind of so jealous from when you found it because it is such a rich organization as well. So the Girls Friendly Society, I will say that when I would look through archival catalogs, initially when I was writing my dissertation, I was particularly interested in migration programs for working class girls. And when I would look through archival catalogs, searching, these different search terms, the Girls Friendly Society kept popping up. But at first, I wasn't that interested in the organization. That very little scholarship had been done on the organization, but what work had been done was really about its relationship with the Anglican Church, how it was emblematic of sort of the conservatism of the late Victorian era. And so I thought on the surface, there's nothing, this doesn't really relate to what I want to find out about, which is about girls' involvement in the empire. But then I kept sort of looking and I kept hitting what I call archival fails. And I'm sure that we've all sort of been there, right? Where you spend hours and hours in the archives and come away with nothing. And this is one of the great challenges, of course, of studying the history of childhood. But eventually, I thought I hit enough archival fails and I thought I have nothing to lose. I'm going to go to the records of the Girls Friendly Society and look into it more. And what I found once I got there is that this is an organization that is actually so much invested in the empire and is involved in the empire in all of these different facets. And that, if I'm trying to understand girls and girlhood in the empire, that this was really a good way of exploring those ideas. So that is, in a sense, how I came to write about the Girls Friendly Society. Now, one thing that I should just note is that in my dissertation, the Girls Friendly Society, it appears, but it's actually kind of a small part of the dissertation. But when it came time to write the book, and I was thinking about, okay, how do I reframe my dissertation project into something that's different for the book? And when I was in the archives, I kept thinking, this organization is so fascinating to me, at least. And I was like, somebody should write a history of it. And so when it came time to write the book, and again, I'm not sort of writing an institutional history of it, but I'm sort of using this as a way in to examine it. But I really saw the Girls Friendly Society as this way to examine all these aspects of girlhood that I wanted to. And one thing that I'll just note too about as I was transforming the dissertation into a book is that I was doing this right when COVID broke out. So right in 2020, I had research trips planned. I had other ideas for what I wanted to do as a book. But then when I wasn't able to travel to the archives, I thought, I have all these records of the Girls Friendly Society and I want to do something more with them. And so that's where sort of the idea of the book came from for really sort of focusing more on the Girls Friendly Society.
I think it's such an interesting story to think about the pathways that bring us to our project. So even, I'm teaching the senior seminar class this semester and students are working on defining their projects. And I think sometimes they think they have to have this like really fleshed out idea already in their head. And yet, when we tell our stories of how we found our way to our thing, like it's so often like a little bit of happenstance, right? I found my thing because I taught at a private school that used this educational curriculum. And, I read Charlotte Mason's book and thought, oh, look, like there's an interesting thing, right?
Yes, yeah,
The
yeah,
archival fails is such an interesting way to
yeah,
think about, a push towards a different thing. But
yeah, yeah,
that we don't have to have all the answers at the beginning. So
yeah.
one of the things I really loved about your book, that we talked about earlier tonight too together, is just the research is so impeccable, like on both sides, right? The archival research, the secondary research, like it's such a lovely model of, right, how the secondary sources help to create this sort of context, and the way you sort of found these things from all different places to help build the context and the methodology and the sort of theoretical underpinnings of the argument. But then the archival research is incredible too, right? Because you got to follow all these little threads in all these different places. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your path through the archives. So you started with these archival fails.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
and then where did your adventures take you?
Yes. Thanks so much. So I think that, I mean, that was, so yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges with this project starting out is that I really very much, wanted to talk about Girls in Empire, but it's like what records you use. And what I started out looking at when I was working on my dissertation was actually looking at the records of girls' schools. And just to give you some examples of sort of like my archival fails. So there were certain schools established in Britain that then had daughter schools in the colonies. And I thought, okay, I'm going to track the girls, or, try and find out about these daughter schools in the colonies. This is a way to get at these questions. And I was so excited. I found a journal of a girl who was at the school, but she wrote this journal about her during her time at the school. And I thought, okay, I like spent all this time on the train to get to this archive to find this journal. And I get there and now I'm like, what was I thinking? I thought I was going to find these brilliant treatises about like British imperial power in there, right? But her journal is really filled with my brother was mean to me today. I want a new hair ribbon and my parents won't buy it for me. And so it made me then sort of rethink, okay, sort of the schools seemed sort of almost like it wasn't getting to those questions. And so that's when I continued to be looking more and more at the Girls Friendly Society and sort of following that. And as I mentioned, what I just found the more that I delved into these records is that they were just so incredibly rich, and were really helping me better understand the different roles that girls had in the Imperial Project. So that was how I sort of followed that down. Now, one thing that I'll just note about the records of the Girls Friendly Society is that a lot of the records, so I really wanted to center girls' voices and experiences in the book. But a lot of the records of the organization are from the women who led it, and that's definitely a challenge. And I think again that's a challenge that many of us face in the history of childhood, but other fields as well. And so I kept sort of grappling with, well, how do I tell girls' stories in this if I only have the records of the adults? But there are these ways that girls begin to speak through these records, right? And unfortunately, like a lot of times it is, in a sense, these problem girls where you have the most information about, right? So girls like Violet Paul, who the GFS leaders are extremely concerned about, running away with this Anglo-Indian man, and girls like Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook, there's a lot of information in the archive about them, but this is because, again, they were sort of these problem girls. And so one thing that I, though, sort of grappled with throughout is, again, sort of this question of voice for the girls. And that's why, in a sense, I really liked the scrapbooks, finding those scrapbooks, because it's clear that girls were involved in the creation of those scrapbooks. And so I felt like, although I have some written records, but not a lot of written records from the girls, I do have these other sources that give you a sense of their perspective about the empire.
It's so interesting because like in my educational society, like I have the opposite sort of issue with
Oh,
the records
okay. Yeah, yeah.
from the children, in that where those sources show up, where the children show up, they're not the problem children, they're like the ideal representative of,
The golden children. Yes,
yes,
yeah.
they're like the perfect example of how you could do, this organization's homeschool curriculum and be,
Yeah, yeah.
perfectly white and British at the end of it all, right? So it
Yes,
sort of
yeah.
trends the other direction, which is an interesting thing to keep, in
Mhm.
terms of thinking about how we interpret and sort of use these kinds of records. But also so
Yeah.
amazing. Like you know, the historical record is a tricky thing and, it's not complete and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, it was like so amazing to open the box and find the thing where it was like in a child's handwriting,
Yes,
them
yeah,
saying a thing. Your
yeah.
scrapbooks look like that too, right?
It was, and it is an amazing feeling to find those because I think so they were actually classified as logbooks. So what I was expecting when I went into the archival box was that these would be like sort of, just these sort of written records, like, recording something. And then to find these scrapbooks was incredible. And I mean, it is, the pages that I showed, well, maybe on some of them you could see, but like they have like pressed flowers in them. And so to think that sort of, that that's in there. And like you said, finding, I didn't show this in the images, but they actually would write essays in the scrapbooks and include that. And so again, like you said, to find sort of these handwritten records of children is really amazing.
That is a way better find for what was characterized as a logbook because I
It
tracked
is.
all archives across England to look at logbooks for schools and found, records of here's who came to school this day and here's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
disciplinary problems that we had today. Not at all what was going to be useful to me. So yours was a better.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that in a sense, that's something good. I mean, I think it was after that that I was basically like, I'm going to take all the records, right? Like, even things that didn't seem useful on the surface, I was like, I'll look at them, because you just never know what you might find. And I mean, I think the same with even like the letters of Violet Paul. Like, if I remember correctly, they were just kind of shoved in a file that was really about sort of the branches in India, but it was largely, sort of like their financial records and like, are like a contract with somebody, and so yeah, but then you just kind of stumble upon these gems in that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, sometimes a scavenger hunt and sometimes a
Yes,
disappointing one, but
yeah.
sometimes a really fun one.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I love how your book though works to give, you're not just thinking about how the girls' friendly society is sort of constructing ideas of empire and girlhood and whiteness, but you work so hard to make sure the girls have a space, right? That sort of thinking about girls as not just passive observers, but active participants and looking for all these opportunities to make sure the girls get to speak for themselves, right? And not just be spoken for. And right, it's such remarkable work because it's hard to find, right, the voices of girls in the archives like that. And so I really appreciated how your book did that work and how your book did that work in not only the places where you had the girls' voices, but in the places where you didn't have the girls' voices. And in a sense, right, the silences become ways to then also represent the girls' voices. And so I know you've talked about this a little bit already, but I wonder if we could just talk a little bit more about sort of how you sort of thought about this work of letting, seeing the girls as not just passive observers, but participants in defining their own ideas about Britishness and whiteness and empire, and also sort of reckoning with their own sort of agency in doing that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think that two examples come to mind right away. And I mean, I think so one is that I really wanted to forefront girls of color in the organization and their experiences. And I actually sort of a couple of years ago, I did manage to go back to the archives, and I spent a month-long archival trip scouring the records of the Girls Friendly Society to find records of girls of color, and they weren't there really. Like they're talked about a little bit, but not in any great detail. And really, sort of the greatest record that I have of girls of color of the organization are those photographs that I showed that would appear in things like their newsletters. But what I realized with that is that in itself is very telling, right? The fact that they were not talking about girls of color, and that this meant that this was an organization that really prided itself on whiteness, that it almost wanted to sort of say that girls of color don't exist in our organization. So I began to realize that sort of the absence in the archive of them was something that I needed to write about, and was telling about the organization. And I mean, I think too that, and this was sort of an insight that I had later on, but for instance, when talking about the decline of the organization, I have volumes and volumes of letters, and sort of different accounts of why the organization declines. But this is all written really from the leaders. All the leaders have different ideas of why girls aren't joining the organization, right? But what I realized sort of very late in the game, and I wanted to hear what girls were saying about it, right? And again, I did have records where from adults saying, well, the girls are saying this about the organization, but I didn't have anything that wasn't sort of unmediated from the girls. But what I realized in that is the very fact that it was declining meant the girls were taking a decision, right? We're making this decision, we're taking this action to not join the organization or leave. So the GFS organizers had all these different ideas about what was causing the decline, but really sort of it was the girls who were in charge of that, right? As much as the GFS leaders didn't almost want to acknowledge that. And so I think that it's funny because initially when I was writing the book, I didn't intend to talk so much about the absences in the archive, but I felt just the more that I went on that I had to talk about it more because it is part of the story of the GFS, and it is part of the story of girlhood and empire as well.
I really appreciated the sort of way you talked about the pieces that were missing in the archives and the challenges in the research, because I thought the argument is so clear and so well done, but then it's like you gave us insight into the sort of architecture and the process that got us there, right? And that's, I think, fun to read about too. So
Thank you.
just two more questions, and then I
Okay.
think we head to discussion. So, your book, I think, just came out in the fall, so pretty
Mhm.
recently published. And again, I am imagining perhaps we have some graduate students in the audience. I wonder if there are any things as you were going through the publishing process that sort of surprised you or that you learned that you wish you'd known beforehand.
That's a very good question. So one of the things I'll say that when I was starting out writing the book, it almost felt like I was back at the beginning of writing my dissertation, because the book, in a sense, is different from the dissertation, and I wasn't at all even sure how to craft a book proposal and things like that. So I think that talking with people who publish definitely helps. Getting examples of book proposals, if you can, that all helps tremendously in the process. And I think that the book process too, I mean, so yeah, so I think this is somewhat standard across publishers, but I submitted a proposal along with sample chapters. The publisher, Manchester University Press, indicated that it was interested, that it would like to see the full manuscript, and then I submitted the full manuscript, and then got reviewer reports back. And I think that from talking with people, I know that the reviewer reports is often the most overwhelming part of the experience. But I mean, I think that it takes some time to work through them, but you do get really constructive advice. And it is actually very helpful to hear sort of what people think about your book, and sort of people that, may not be that familiar with your project before they read the manuscript. And then once I made the revisions that were necessary, I resubmitted the manuscript, and then it was then accepted at that point. And so it was somewhat of a long process, I guess, as all things are, but it in the end was a very, very rewarding one. And one of the things that I'll just sort of maybe say about in terms of finding a publisher is that I know that the advice that I was given was look at your bookshelf, and wherever sort of the most books that you have are published, go with that publisher. And that's kind of what I did, because I was very much influenced by the Studies in Imperialism series. But I would also say to make sure to work with, an editor and a publisher that you feel is very invested in your work, or, because I think that really makes all the difference. Talking with other people, I think that sort of who you have as an editor makes just a world of difference. And if you have a good relationship with your editor, and if you feel like your editor believes in your work, that makes a huge difference in the process.
One last question to finish our conversation for the evening. What's your next project? And in fairness, I should say, I told Elizabeth when we talked about beforehand that a perfectly great answer is my next thing is prepping for a brand new class in the fall. Because, right, life as an academic brings many challenges. So what's next?
So it is that as well. But I am also, so what I will say is that I had this idea for a second project for a long time. It again actually has its origins during my time as a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I wrote a seminar paper in MJ Mains's class about contest over statues in India. And so that was always going to be my second project. And I think that I may still do something with debates over British statues in India, but I also am finding it really hard to move away from girlhood. And I think that, so I have kind of two projects related to girlhood that I'm continuing to work on a little bit. So one is about girls in photography. And again, this is coming really from the book that thinking about oftentimes there's been a rich literature about colonial photography, but not a lot talks about girls. And the work that exists about girls is often girls as the subject of photos. But what I'm interested in is girls as photographers documenting empire and how this then spread colonial knowledge. So this is very much sort of inspired by the work that I was doing on scrapbooks and things like that. And then I'm also going back to something that I originally was part of my dissertation and then cut, but this was about girls' schools. So I'm hoping to go back and do some more work there because I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done about sort of these imperial networks of girls' education. So those are a couple of the projects that I'm working on right now. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm thankful. I feel like Anna was kind of the nexus that we both found our way to.
Yes.
And even though, like, it was, we didn't actually overlap, I don't think, in graduate school. We found each other at these conferences. So I'm glad we had Anna as sort of a nexus to find our way to each other, because it's been lovely to get to be a historian of childhood in the British Empire with you. So thanks for inviting me
Yes.
tonight to talk with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all your wonderful questions.
Well, yes, thank you to both of you for such an interesting conversation about a really terrific book. And MJ has already started us off in the chat with a question, and I invite others to chime in as well. And indeed, Anna just put in, Anna Clark, a comment about it's thrilling to see you both together. But MJ's question is that she and Ann Waltner are co-teaching a grad seminar on global gender history. Many of the students are preparing syllabi as their seminar project. Two of them are Childhood in England and the British Empire and Gender in Southern Africa in Colonial and Post-Colonial Regimes. And so she asks, how might your book work for these courses?
That is a fantastic question, and those sound like fantastic courses. I might have to ask you for those syllabi. So I mean, I think that childhood in England and the British Empire, I mean, just sort of the book as a whole would be good for that. I mean, I think that specifically sort of the opening chapters where I talk about the anxieties around childhood and empire would be fantastic. And also the gender in Southern Africa and colonial and post-colonial regimes. That the book I do talk about South Africa or Southern Africa does appear really throughout the book, but there's I would say maybe there's two chapters in particular that really focus on Southern Africa. So, I mean, in there, this is where I talk a lot about the girls of color in the organization. So, I have chapters on the scrapbooks, but then also the ways that uh, girls of color were pushing back against the imperatives of the GFS. And I think also perhaps the last full chapter of the book talks about the decline of the GFS, but in many ways, this is also, I talk about how it's mirroring in many ways the changes, the broader changes in empire that are occurring, the changes that are occurring in the GFS as the empire is becoming a commonwealth, and as parts of the empire are declaring greater independence, we see similar calls being made in the GFS. So I think that this book would be great for both the classes, and those do sound like fascinating classes.
I'll go ahead and pose a question. One of the things that really stood out for me in the book was this tension of these expectations put on these girls as they went out, particularly the ones who were, encouraged to emigrate into empire, and that there was this ideology of purity, and they were going to be mothers and creating white households and serving as models of Britishness out in the colonies, but also that they were needed as labor. So this kind of tension that they were also, in fact, expected to work, and particularly as domestic servants. And that really, I just, and the case you have of the girls who run away from a really, kind of abusive household that they end up in, I just think about these girls, it's really a poignant kind of story of these pressures that were put on them. And then they often found themselves isolated, both from their
Yeah.
homes and families, but even from each other, that they didn't have a
Mhm.
place to gather. So I don't know if that's not exactly a question, Elizabeth, but if you want to.
No, yeah, I mean, I found that really interesting as well. And the fact that they're told, right, that going out to these colonies, that there is going to be paradise, right? That they're going to be treated as members of the family, and then they find that that's not the case at all. And so I think that that was really interesting. And what's interesting too is the fact that the GFS leaders eventually do pick up on this, but it's too late, right? That maybe we're actually doing more harm than good in trying to portray the colonies in this idyllic light. And eventually they sort of say, okay, we should maybe rethink how we're trying to encourage girls to go out. But I mean, I think that those stories I mean, yeah, Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook running away. And the story of Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook, it's very interesting because their letters, I mean, they write just so powerfully in the letters, and they have, I think, some of my favorite quotes in the book. For instance, Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook are arrested because they break their contract, and they're put on trial, and the trial does not go their way. The judge finds in favor of the household that they're working for, the Robinson household. And Eliza Hobbs will write back to Ellen Joyce, who was the leader of the immigration department of the GFS, and say, basically, the law seems made for moneyed people, and sort of these insights that they have, right? And saying that it wasn't justice what was done. And so I really, those stories, I thank you for mentioning that, because I did find those stories very powerful.
Thanks. And Anna has put a question in following up on imperialism. I was teaching today on interwar empire and the idea of trusteeship. Did GFS pick up on that? Of course, trusteeship just is just a cover for imperial expansion.
That's a really good question. They did actually, and they did before, though, the interwar years, in a sense. So the GFS in Britain would actually tightly control the GFS in India. Other imperial branches were allowed to kind of have a little bit more independence, but the idea of them having greater control over India was basically that India was so big that they needed to take this greater care and control over the GFS branches. So we do see that idea a little bit. And then what happens in the interwar years, and I alluded to this briefly before, but we see then those Indian branches pushing back against this idea and saying, we need greater freedom, we need greater flexibility. And so that idea definitely is there. And again, sort of one of my favorite stories coming from the Indian branches, as the Indian branches are, really upset with the fact that the GFS leaders in London are trying to dictate how they're running their branches in India. There's this one woman in particular who's always writing these letters back saying, we need greater freedom, we need greater flexibility here. And the GFS leaders in London will call her Gandhi. So they'll refer to her in the letters as our Gandhi, like our Gandhi is at it again. And so you do have sort of these mirroring, definitely, of broader imperial relations and policies. And one thing that I just wanted to note too, and this is sort of not about trusteeship per se, but as in the post-World War II years, the GFS kind of forms its own version of the Commonwealth. So it starts to realize that the empire is not going to be this link anymore. And so it will develop what it calls the World Council instead. So it's no longer connected by the empire, it's connected by this World Council. But we can again sort of see this mirroring of imperial structures and imperial policies.
Right. And we have a question from one of our current graduate students, Chun Chen, who's working on girlhood in early imperial China. And she says, hi, Elizabeth, thank you for the excellent talk. I'm curious about what you think is the biggest difference between writing a doctoral dissertation and a monograph. And what was the biggest challenge you faced in turning your dissertation into a book?
Hi, Cece. Thank you so much for the question. So it's a really good question. So I think that the biggest difference between writing a doctoral dissertation and a monograph is the question of audience. So in the dissertation, a lot of it is trying to show your knowledge of a subject. And the audience, and oftentimes you can expect that your audience, who are your advisors and committee members, have a certain knowledge about this, that there's sort of this assumed knowledge, but that's not necessarily the case with a book, that you have to provide a little bit more background information. But I think that one of the biggest sort of changes I made was to the introduction, was because the introduction in my dissertation is very much sort of like showing that, look at, I know all these scholars who wrote about empire, right? And gender and empire and childhood and empire. And that was significantly scaled back in the book, that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And in terms of the biggest challenge of turning my dissertation into a book, I honestly think it was just trying to think through how to reconceptualize it. Because, I had been told by all these editors and publishers that they're not interested in publishing a dissertation. And so it's like, okay, how do I do a different project, but also one that doesn't require me to basically start over entirely, right? And again, another complicating factor to that in this case was COVID. And so, how do I take the research that I have and do something new with it? And so I think that honestly, for me, the hardest part was the reconceptualization of the project. And once I had so many different ideas of how I was going to go in different directions with the book, but then once I sort of landed on this idea, that was sort of the biggest hurdle to get over. So I think that was it. And as I mentioned, when you do get to that stage, I think reaching out to people, it's really, really helpful. That I know that to me, it felt like I had no idea what I was doing. And so, just talking to people and sort of saying, like, how do you write a book proposal? That was actually really, really helpful. And I'm happy, once you get to that stage, please reach out to me and I'm happy to share any insight that I have.
Well, it's great to have those connections and that networking going on. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you want to talk, one of the central parts of the book and of the organization, the Girls Friendly Society, that you haven't talked about is the rule. And that plays a big role throughout, and particularly also in its decline, that the sort of
Mhm.
punitiveness of the rule. I don't know, do you want to talk about the rule at all?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question because it is sort of I feel like every time I try and talk about it briefly, it just like it gets too complicated. But so the GFS had basically three rules of membership and they called them the central rules. And one of the central rules was that girls had to be pure. And so the GFS was really obsessed with ideas of purity. Now the question is, what does it mean to be pure? It was often interpreted, although it was never laid down explicitly, that girls had to be virgins to be members of the GFS. Now, this rule, though, about purity actually causes a lot of difficulties because it is never said explicitly. So, actually, there's some girls who think that they can't be members of the GFS because, for instance, they enjoy going out dancing and they think this means that they'll be impure. And one thing that I wasn't able to put into the book is that this rule actually does get the GFS into legal trouble because they will kick out a girl of the organization in Ireland for being impure. But by kicking her out, they basically were saying that she was no longer a virgin, right? And so she actually sues the GFS for kind of the equivalent of slander or something like this. But how it contributes to the decline is that I think, especially by the 1920s and 1930s, it had just become clear that this was a really outdated rule. And it had been this point of contention really since the central rule was put into place. But what we see happening in the 1920s and 1930s is that there's actually efforts to revise the rules. But again, you have sort of these leaders of the organization who say, well, this is what makes us distinct, and we can't admit elements of impurity into the organization. And if we do, this is just going to mean the ruin of the organization. But what happens in the 1920s and 1930s is that, and this is particularly happening in India, is I have letters from like different bishops and archbishops in India who will write and basically say like this is very much going against the Christian ideals. And the GFS was tightly connected to the Anglican Church. And they are basically saying, this goes against Christian ideals. We should be helping these girls. We should not be excluding them and ostracizing them. And so this is sort of one of the things where we see sort of this breakdown of the GFS, that there are, the people who are at the head of the GFS want to hold fast to the rule, but a lot of the leaders on the ground see that this rule is really something that's holding the organization back and contributing to this idea that the GFS is this old-fashioned and outdated organization that no longer speaks to girls' needs. So it is very, very much crucial in their decline. Yeah. Thank you for raising that question.
Yeah, and I liked how you phrased it at one point I think near the end of the book, that the GFS was in the end sort of about girlhood without serving the girls. That the
Yeah.
goal it originally was supposed to be, we need to be serving the needs of the girls, but then they weren't, and that glad.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see also that MJ's, if anyone is going to the social science history meeting, I don't know when it is this year, but is that right? You're going to have a session, Elizabeth,
Yeah,
of
it's in November. Yeah.
in November. Okay, so that's another great chance. And I really, hope it's wonderful that you were able to get an open access link for the book.
Yeah.
So that people who
Yeah.
are now their interest is piqued, they can go and look for your book and read some of these great stories and great analysis and research that you've done. It's really an incredible accomplishment.
Thank
So we're
you.
getting close to the top of the hour here. So I want to thank Elizabeth for sharing this book with us. Thank Rachel for posing these great questions and engaging in the conversation. And for all of you who have come to see it. Our next book club is April 17th, which is a Thursday instead of a Wednesday. And Jojo Bell, who's actually a current PhD student in our department, is going to be talking about her book, Red Stained, The Life of Hilda Sims, in conversation with Will Jones, who's a professor in our department. I think also Amanda's put a link if you want to go ahead and pre-register for that one. And she's also put in a link, the gifts that come into the history department really support the work of our graduate students who go on to become alumni and publish these really excellent books. So if you're so moved, you can click on that link. And then, although we're closing out the formal book session, Elizabeth and Rachel both said they can stay on for a little while, and then we can unmute people. And if you want to turn on your cameras and unmute and just greet them and say hello, we can do that. But we'll thank Elizabeth and Rachel for a really great book session.